In the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, far from the reach of the outside world, the Duskor family's tragic story unfolded. A tale of isolation, forbidden unions, and a bloodline doomed by its own choices. Alaric Duskor, a man with unwavering belief in the purity of his bloodline, established his home in the mountains, isolating his family from all others. Over generations, his descendants clung to this isolation, resulting in a fate no one could escape. This is the story of two sons, born in defiance of all odds, whose deformities marked the beginning of the family's tragic end. Their bond, unbreakable and unsettling, became the very thing that sealed their doom. Before we continue uncovering the mysteries of the Duskor bloodline, make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. Share the story with others who appreciate dark histories and forgotten tales. Alaric Duskor arrived in the rugged, isolated Appalachian Mountains in 1792. He sought refuge from the corrupt world beyond, choosing the land not for its beauty, but for its seclusion, to safeguard his bloodline. Alaric believed that purity could only be preserved through isolation. He wanted no outsiders, no outside influence on his line. He considered his bloodline sacred, needing protection above all. And so, he built his settlement deep in the mountains. Alaric's descendants, the Duskor men, carried on his belief. The family line was founded on the principle that only through isolation could they maintain strength. Marriages within the family were considered natural, even necessary. By the time Jonas Duskor inherited the estate, the Duskor men had grown deeply suspicious of outsiders. They lived within their secluded estate, working the land and building their legacy, free from outside interference. Jonas, now the patriarch, was steeped in the traditions of his ancestors. He, like his father before him, believed in the importance of maintaining the purity of the bloodline. The isolation was his birthright. The estate, built by Alaric himself, stood as a fortress, a monument to their belief in the sanctity of their bloodline. Its thick wooden walls held the secrets of generations, sealed away from the world outside. In 1915, Jonas, following family tradition, married his cousin. It wasn't a choice, it was a duty. The Duskor men had always married within the bloodline. They did not see this as strange or wrong. It was simply how it was done. Their union was a quiet one, devoid of ceremony or celebration. The only witnesses were the family men. Outsiders had no place in their world. The bond between them was rooted in duty and an unwavering sense of family legacy. The first children born to Jonas were frail and quiet, their development slower than expected. The Duskor men, however, were quick to dismiss these anomalies. They chalked it up to God's tests, certain their bloodline was pure. But in 1929, during the worst storm the region had seen in years, the twins were born. Arender and Elson, though fragile, defied every expectation of survival. Their deformities were immediate and undeniable, and the family could not ignore them. The midwives, both seasoned women, gasped when they saw the twins. Their heads were misshapen, and their limbs underdeveloped. But to Jonas, this was merely another trial, something to be endured, as it had always been. The doctor who was called to examine the twins was horrified by what he saw. His diagnosis was clear. The deformities were the result of prolonged consanguinity, the consequence of generations of inbreeding. But Jonas refused to accept this. He dismissed the doctor's diagnosis, saying the family's ways were justified by tradition. Their bloodline was sacred, and these deformities were simply tests sent by God. The doctor's advice to seek outside help was ignored. The twins, though weak, survived. They were bonded in a way that seemed supernatural. When they were apart, their distress was palpable. It was as though their very existence depended on being together. Jonas, though troubled by the twins' condition, believed that they were meant to be. The Duskor legacy, after all, was one of strength, and these children, despite their deformities, represented the survival of the bloodline. The family estate, once alive with the sound of men working, became a quieter place. The twins' cries filled the house, their bond becoming more powerful with each passing year. The family could no longer deny the toll their isolation had taken. Jonas watched as the twins grew. Their bond deepened, and their dependence on one another became even more pronounced. It was as though they were one being, split into two. And Jonas felt a strange mixture of pride and fear. As the twins grew older, their condition worsened. They were unable to walk, unable to speak, their bodies frail and underdeveloped. But Jonas continued to care for them, believing that their survival was a testament to the strength of the Duskor bloodline. Despite the growing hardships, Jonas remained unwavering. The Duskor men had always fought through adversity, and he would not let his bloodline perish. Even as the estate became a quieter, more desolate place, he refused to acknowledge the true cost of their isolation. The land outside their estate remained untouched, and their connection to the outside world continued to wither. The Duskor men had lived for generations with this isolation, and they believed it was their right to remain so, untouched, pure, and unbroken. But the truth began to settle in, slowly. The house, now filled only with the sounds of the twins' cries and Jonas's solitary work, had begun to feel like a prison. The Duskor bloodline, once so strong, was now fragile and slowly fading. The mountain, once a refuge, was now the only place left for the Duskor men. And in the stillness of the estate, Jonas could no longer deny the truth. The bloodline he had fought so hard to preserve was, in the end, doomed. The Duskor legacy, passed down through generations, was built on a foundation of isolation and purity. But the price of maintaining such purity was never fully understood until the curse of consanguinity began to manifest itself. Alaric Duskor, the patriarch of the family, had always believed that purity of blood was the key to strength. Marriages within the family were the law of the land. Outsiders were seen as a threat to their way of life. As generations passed, the family's devotion to preserving this purity only intensified. Sons married daughters, nephews married nieces, and cousins married cousins. The isolation they cherished became a prison, and their bloodline began to deteriorate. It was a slow decline at first. Children born to the Duskor men began to exhibit strange physical traits. Their growth was stunted, their eyes had strange colors, and their limbs didn't develop as expected. Yet, the family dismissed it as fate's trials. By the time Jonas Duskor inherited the estate, the signs of the family's deteriorating lineage were impossible to ignore. Children were being born with deformities, and the once proud Duskor bloodline seemed to be slowly fading away. The Duskor men, however, never wavered in their belief. They saw the deformities as God's judgment, or, more often, as trials sent to test their strength. There was no room for doubt. Purity was all that mattered, even at the expense of health. The doctors who were called to examine the children were horrified. One physician, in particular, recorded his findings with cold precision: severe cranial malformations, underdeveloped limbs, and other deformities that pointed to the consequences of inbreeding. Yet his diagnosis was ignored. The Duskor men dismissed the doctor's words. The family's isolation, their refusal to mingle with outsiders, was their right. The Duskor bloodline, though tarnished, was theirs to protect and continue. The cost of that protection, they believed, was justified. Despite the deformities and the increasingly frail health of their children, the Duskor men continued their traditions. The family remained closed off, refusing to allow any outside influence, no matter how damaging it had become to their lineage. Jonas, burdened by the weight of his ancestors' expectations, was determined to preserve the legacy. His children, despite their deformities, were still his flesh and blood. Their survival, he believed, was proof of the strength of the Duskor name. But as the years passed, the toll of the family's isolation became undeniable. The deformities worsened, and it became clear that the Duskor bloodline had paid a heavy price for its devotion to purity. The cost of maintaining the family's ideals was visible in every child born. The twins, Arinder and Elson, were the most striking example of the consequences of consanguinity. Their deformities were so severe that even the Duskor men could no longer deny the truth. The bloodline had been irrevocably damaged. Despite the worsening condition of the twins, Jonas remained steadfast in his belief that the family must endure. The Duskor bloodline, though twisted by generations of inbreeding, was sacred, and Jonas would do anything to preserve it, even if it meant watching his sons suffer. The land surrounding the estate had become barren, the soil unyielding, and the mountain that had once offered refuge now seemed indifferent to the Duskor men's plight. The family's isolation was no longer a source of pride. It had become a curse. As Jonas watched the twins grow weaker, a feeling of dread began to settle in. The family's survival had always depended on their devotion to purity, but now it was clear that the very thing they had held dear was the source of their undoing. Jonas, alone in his pride and determination, refused to seek help. The mountain, the estate, and the bloodline were all he had left. To call for outside help would be an admission of failure, and he was not ready to face that. In the stillness of the estate, the cries of the twins echoed through the halls. Their bond, though strong, had become a prison in itself. They depended on each other for survival, but their bodies continued to deteriorate under the weight of their deformities. Despite the growing fear, Jonas held on to the belief that the family could survive. The Duskor bloodline, after all, had withstood centuries of isolation. But the truth was becoming harder and harder to deny. The cost of purity was far greater than anyone had anticipated. The estate, once a symbol of the Duskor family's strength, now stood as a monument to their downfall. The walls that had once protected them now seemed to close in, trapping them in their own legacy of isolation and pride. Jonas's thoughts were consumed by the fate of his bloodline. He had once believed that isolation was the key to survival, but now, with his son's cries haunting him, he began to question the very beliefs that had sustained him. But despite the mounting evidence of the family's decline, Jonas refused to surrender. The Duskor bloodline, for better or worse, was his to protect. Even if it meant facing the devastating consequences of their past decisions, he would never let it go. The year 1929 brought with it a storm of unprecedented intensity, one that would change the fate of the Duskor family forever. Jonas and his kin, isolated from the world, had long lived in their secluded estate. However, fate would force its hand, and with it the birth of the twins, Arinder and Elson. The estate was blanketed by snow, and the winter winds howled with a ferocity that seemed to echo the growing tension inside. Jonas, preparing for the birth of his children, had a quiet unease settle deep within him. He had lived with the burden of his bloodline for years, but this felt different. There was something about the storm that seemed to carry a darker omen. The first child, Arinder, entered the world in a quiet, almost unnatural silence. The midwife, accustomed to difficult births, was taken aback by the deformities that immediately marked him. His skull was misshapen, and his limbs were underdeveloped. The family had always expected trials, but this was beyond what they had ever faced. The second child, Elson, followed shortly after. The storm outside raged louder, as if in response to the birth of these two sons. His body, too, was marked by deformity. His arms and legs appeared twisted, and his head seemed too large for his small frame. The air in the room grew thick with dread, and it seemed as if time itself held its breath. Jonas, though shocked, remained silent. He had seen the signs before, and though this was more severe, he knew the Duskor bloodline had endured worse. Their isolation, their purity, their devotion to the family's legacy It was all that mattered. These sons, born in such strange circumstances, would be part of that legacy. The midwife, after a long silence, looked at Jonas and said, "They won't survive long. The deformities are too severe. It's the bloodline's curse." Her words stung, but Jonas, ever proud, rejected them with a cold dismissal. The family's purity had been tested before, and they had survived. Why would this be any different? Days passed, and the estate became eerily quiet. The twins, fragile as they were, continued to breathe, to live, defying the doctor's predictions. Jonas and his family cared for them with a mixture of fear, awe, and stubborn pride. They were his flesh and blood, and he refused to let them be abandoned. As the days turned into weeks, Jonas's hope grew. He knew the family had endured countless trials before, and he was certain the twins, though weak and deformed, would survive. The family's purity was a powerful thing, and this was simply another test, one that they would overcome. Yet the twins were not like other children. Their cries were not the cries of typical infants. They were almost synchronized, as if they shared a single soul between the two of them. When one of them cried, the other followed suit, as if their distress was not their own but a shared experience. Jonas watched in silence as the twins grew, their bond deepening with each passing day. They were inseparable, dependent on one another in ways that seemed unnatural, even to the Duskor men. They never seemed to be apart, and when they were, their distress was palpable. It was as if their very survival depended on being together. Jonas, though proud of their defiance against the odds, began to feel a sense of unease. Their bond, so strong, was almost unnatural. It was as though they were two halves of a single being, trapped in separate bodies. He had never seen anything like it before, and though he believed it was a sign of the family's strength, a small part of him began to fear the consequences of such an intense connection. As the twins grew, their physical condition worsened. They were unable to sit, unable to walk, their limbs still underdeveloped. Despite this, Jonas held on to the belief that they were meant to live, meant to continue the Duskor legacy. He could not fathom the idea of their deaths. After all, they were his sons, and nothing, not even deformity, could erase that bond. The more time passed, the more Jonas's obsession with the twins grew. He kept them close, never allowing them to be separated. The family, once full of work and purpose, now seemed to revolve around the twins' care. Jonas, though physically worn from the effort, refused to give up. He saw their survival as proof of the strength of the Duskor bloodline. The bond between the twins became the heart of the estate. The estate, once filled with the sounds of men working, now echoed only with the twins' cries, their constant need for one another. Jonas's world had narrowed to these two sons, and every thought, every action, seemed to be directed towards ensuring their survival. But the burden of caring for the twins was wearing on the family. The other members of the Duskor estate, once strong and proud men, began to pull away. They could not bear the constant distress, the cries that never seemed to end. It was as if the twins' presence had cast a shadow over the estate, a shadow that no one could escape. Jonas, though, remained resolute. The bloodline, despite its cost, was sacred to him. These sons were his legacy, and no matter the price, he would protect them. He saw their bond as a sign of strength, proof that their family was meant to endure. Nothing could break them, not even the deformities or the isolation that had once been their greatest protection. As the twins' condition worsened, however, Jonas began to question the wisdom of the family's isolation. The world beyond the mountains had been rejected for so long, and yet it seemed that their own bloodline was what had cursed them. But Jonas's pride would never allow him to seek outside help. He believed that the Duskor legacy must be protected at all costs, even if it meant sacrificing everything. The birth of the twins, though a grim prophecy fulfilled, was not the end. It was only the beginning of a long, painful struggle. The Duskor men, bound by pride and isolation, had set their own course, and now they would pay the price for that choice. As the years passed, the Duskor estate became even more secluded, the family's isolation intensifying with each new season. The mountain that had once provided a refuge now seemed to trap the family in a self-imposed prison. Jonas, despite the growing struggles of caring for the twins, remained firm in his belief that isolation was the family's protection. The outside world, with its corrupting influences, was a threat he refused to expose his family to. The estate, now weathered by time and neglect, stood as a symbol of Jonas's unwavering determination to protect the family's legacy. The house had once been a symbol of strength, but now it seemed to echo only with the sounds of the twins' cries. The land surrounding the estate had become barren, as though nature itself had rejected the Duskor family's presence. The once proud fields now yielded nothing, and the once thriving livestock had dwindled, their survival tied to the family's dwindling resources. Despite these hardships, Jonas refused to leave the estate. The family had lived in isolation for generations, and to break from that tradition would be to betray everything they had fought to preserve. The bloodline was sacred, and its purity was all that mattered, all that. The family's few remaining members, all men, had taken on roles of responsibility, repairing the estate, working the land, and caring for the twins. Yet, despite their best efforts, the family seemed to be slowly falling apart, worn down by the endless strain of survival. Jonas, though deeply concerned for his sons, refused to admit the toll their condition was taking. The twins' bond had grown stronger with time, and their dependence on one another was now so deep that separating them was no longer an option. Despite their physical weaknesses, the twins grew older, their bond becoming more powerful. When one of them fell ill, the other would mirror the symptoms. It was as though they shared a single body, each inextricably linked to the other. Jonas watched this connection with a mixture of pride and fear. He saw it as a mark of strength, proof that the Duskor bloodline could endure anything, but a part of him began to wonder if the bond between the twins was not a sign of strength, but of something darker. The days were long and difficult, filled with work that seemed endless. The men of the estate, Jonas, his brothers, and the few remaining Duskor kin, spent their days tending to the needs of the twins, ensuring their survival. But the work was taking its toll. As the years dragged on, the isolation felt more suffocating. The estate was cut off from the outside world, and the Duskor men were growing weary. The mountain, which had once been a source of pride, now felt like a prison, its cold walls closing in on them. Jonas, though weary himself, refused to leave. His pride would not allow him to seek help from outsiders. He believed that their family's survival depended on their strength and isolation. No outside influence would ever be allowed to weaken their bloodline. The twins, though physically frail, continued to grow older. Their bond deepened, and their cries became more synchronized, more desperate. Jonas could not help but feel a sense of awe at their survival, but he also felt a growing dread. Their connection seemed unnatural, as if they were both tethered to something much darker. As winter set in again, the estate grew quieter. The days were shorter, the nights colder, and the sounds of the outside world seemed to fade further away. The Duskor men had built their world within the walls of the estate, and now it felt as though that world was slipping away. Despite the growing sense of despair, Jonas remained resolute. His pride, his belief in the purity of the Duskor bloodline, kept him going. The family's survival was all that mattered. The outside world, with all its corruption, was something he would never let his family be exposed to. The mountain had become a place of torment, its harsh weather and isolation wearing down the Duskor men. The land that had once been a source of strength now seemed to mock them, as if nature itself had turned against their bloodline. But Jonas refused to acknowledge that their isolation, had become a curse. He could not see the truth that was staring him in the face, that the very thing they had clung to for generations, the purity of their bloodline, was what had led them to this point. The twins, though surviving, were a constant reminder of the price the Duskor men had paid for their beliefs. Their deformities, their bond, their cries, all of it seemed to be a sign that the family's devotion to purity had come at too great a cost. The estate, now a decaying shell of its former self, stood as a testament to the Duskor men's refusal to change. The walls, once strong and proud, now seemed weak and hollow. The mountain that had once protected them now seemed to hold them captive, as if it too were growing tired of their presence. Jonas, though deeply troubled by the state of the estate, refused to admit that the family's isolation had failed them. His pride kept him from seeking help. The Duskor bloodline, though damaged, was his responsibility, and he would see it through to the end. As the winter wore on, the Duskor men continued their struggle for survival. The land had turned against them, the estate was falling apart, and the twins' condition was worsening. But Jonas remained steadfast. The purity of the bloodline was all that mattered. The isolation that had once been a source of strength had become a prison. But Jonas could not see that. His pride would not allow him to acknowledge the truth, that the very thing he had believed in had led them to the brink of destruction. As the years dragged on, the once proud Duskor estate began to deteriorate, much like the family that had built it. The harshness of the land, once a refuge, had become a relentless adversary. Every season brought a new struggle, yet Jonas remained unwavering. The survival of his sons, fragile as they were, and the preservation of the Duskor bloodline were now all that mattered. Jonas, though aging, still worked tirelessly to maintain the estate. The land that had once yielded bountiful crops now produced only meager harvests. The livestock, once plentiful, had dwindled, and the estate's resources seemed to shrink with each passing year. Yet Jonas's resolve remained unshaken. His pride, which had once fueled his belief in the purity of his bloodline, now became the very thing that kept him going. The twins, Arender and Elson, despite their deformities, had survived. But their condition worsened as the years went on. Their bodies remained weak and underdeveloped, and they relied on one another more than ever. The bond they shared, once a symbol of survival, had become a heavy burden. The family's resources, already limited, were now stretched thin by the twins' constant care. The estate, once alive with the sounds of men working, now echoed with the cries of the twins. Their dependency on one another was intense, and when separated, their distress was palpable. Jonas could see the strain this was putting on the other men in the household. The estate, which had once been a proud symbol of strength, now seemed to be a place of decay, a testament to the costs of their isolation. Despite the growing challenges, Jonas never considered reaching out for help. The outside world remained an unknown, a place full of corrupting forces that would only seek to destroy the Duskor bloodline. Their isolation had kept them safe for generations, and it would not fail them now. The bloodline must endure, no matter the cost. As the winter months grew harsher, the estate became increasingly difficult to manage. The cold seeped into the walls, and the once pristine grounds became overrun with weeds. The land seemed to fight back against the Duskor men's presence, as if rejecting their claim to it. But Jonas refused to yield. His stubborn pride pushed him to keep working, even when it seemed hopeless. The other men on the estate, though loyal, began to show signs of wear. They were worn down by the constant work and the relentless demands of caring for the twins. The burden of maintaining the estate and providing for their family had become too much to bear. Yet none of them dared challenge Jonas's authority. The Duskor bloodline was sacred, and no matter how difficult the path, they would continue to walk it. Jonas's focus, however, was always on the twins. Their cries were a constant reminder of the price they had paid for their isolation. When one twin fell ill, the other seemed to follow. Their bond had become a strange, unsettling thing, one that seemed to feed off their shared suffering. It was as if their survival depended on their mutual pain, and Jonas feared what might happen if they were ever separated. But the strain of caring for the twins was beginning to take its toll on Jonas as well. The once proud patriarch of the Duskor family, who had weathered the hardships of the land with strength and determination, was beginning to show signs of exhaustion. His body ached with each movement, and his mind seemed to grow clouded by the weight of his responsibilities. Yet he refused to rest. His duty to the bloodline, to his sons, was all that mattered. The men on the estate continued to toil, repairing buildings, hunting, and working the land. But the estate was no longer thriving. The work had become a never-ending cycle, and it seemed as though nothing they did could change the course of their fate. The Duskor bloodline, once so powerful, now felt fragile and brittle, like a thread ready to snap. Jonas, though physically worn down, remained resolute. He believed that their struggle was part of the family's destiny. The Duskor men had always been fighters. They had always survived. And no matter how dire their situation seemed, Jonas refused to acknowledge that they were anything but destined for survival. As the twins grew older, their conditions seemed to worsen. Their once constant cries became more frequent, more desperate. Their physical weakness had reached a point where they could no longer move independently. They depended entirely on one another and on the family for their survival. The estate, which had once been a place of hope, now felt suffocating, a place where survival was no longer guaranteed. Jonas's focus was solely on the twins. They were his legacy, his future, and his greatest burden. He could not and would not let them die. The idea of seeking help from the outside world was unthinkable. The Duskor bloodline must endure, no matter the cost, even if it meant enduring suffering beyond what they had ever known. The other men on the estate could see the toll this was taking on Jonas. He had become a shadow of his former self, his body weakened by years of hard labor, his mind clouded with worry, but none of them dared speak against him. The Duskor legacy was all they had left, and they too were bound by the same unyielding pride that held Jonas in its grip. Despite the growing strain on the estate and the family, Jonas remained focused on one thing: survival. The Duskor bloodline would not die in the mountains, not as long as he had breath in his body. The land, the weather, and even the twins themselves were mere challenges to overcome. The bloodline would endure no matter how difficult the road ahead. But as the years passed and the estate continued to decline, Jonas's conviction began to waver. The weight of his family's legacy, the burden of the twins' care, and the failure of the land began to wear on him. His once unshakable belief in the purity of the bloodline began to crack, but he refused to let that truth emerge. The isolation, which had once protected the Duskor family, had now become their prison. The walls of the estate, once symbols of pride and strength, now seemed to close in around Jonas and his sons. The bloodline, despite its purity, had been marred by years of inbreeding and isolation. Yet Jonas, ever proud, refused to see the truth. The Duskor bloodline must survive, no matter the cost. As the years passed, the bond between Arnder and Elson grew even more intense, something beyond the understanding of any Duskor man. They were no longer just twins. They were a single being split into two fragile bodies. Jonas, watching them closely, began to see a pattern. The twins shared everything: their pain, their joy, their suffering. Everything was felt equally. Their bond, though unnatural, seemed almost sacred in its intensity, like a force that held them together. It was not just the physical deformities that marked them, it was the way they interacted. When one moved, the other moved in perfect synchrony. When one cried, the other would follow, their voices blending in a haunting harmony. Jonas, though unsettled by this unnatural connection, refused to acknowledge it. He saw it as a testament to the strength of the Duskor bloodline, a mark of their ability to endure, even in the face of deformity. But as the twins grew older, their bond only deepened, becoming something even more unsettling. They began to show signs of strange behaviors, mirroring each other's movements, completing each other's sentences. It was as if their minds were as intertwined as their bodies. Jonas, though deeply proud of the twins' resilience, began to fear for them. Their bond, though a sign of survival, also seemed like a curse. They depended on each other in a way that no two people ever should. At night, when the estate was quiet, Jonas would sometimes hear the twins whispering to each other. Their voices, though soft, would send a chill down his spine. It was as though they were speaking a language only they could understand, a language born of their shared existence. The more Jonas observed, the more he became convinced that their connection was not natural. It was as though they were bound by something far darker than blood. Yet, he pushed the thought away. The Duskor bloodline was pure and nothing could break it. The other men on the estate, though loyal, began to grow uneasy. They noticed the strange behaviors in the twins as well. They had seen the bond between the twins grow over the years, and now it was more intense than ever. But no one dared speak of it aloud. Jonas, though increasingly concerned, would not allow anyone to discuss it. To him, the twins were his legacy, his sons, and their bond was a sign of their strength. He refused to let their connection become a weakness. But even Jonas could not ignore the growing tension. As the twins grew older, their need for each other became more pronounced. They no longer slept apart. They shared everything, even the smallest of gestures. It was as though they were two halves of a single soul, unable to exist without the other. Jonas, despite his pride, began to see the cracks in the family's foundation. The bond between the twins, though a sign of survival, was also a reminder of the damage that had been done to their bloodline. The cost of isolation was beginning to manifest itself in ways he could no longer deny. As the estate continued to decay, the twins' condition worsened. They were frail, unable to move without help, and their cries became more frequent. Yet, no matter how much they suffered, they never let go of each other. Their bond was unbreakable, and they clung to one another with a desperation that terrified Jonas. Jonas, though deeply troubled, could not bring himself to separate them. The thought of breaking their connection seemed unthinkable. They were his sons, his legacy, and their survival was proof of the strength of the Duskor bloodline. The estate had become a place of shadow and silence. The men who worked the land no longer spoke of the future, for they knew that the Duskor bloodline was fading, that the family was slowly crumbling under the weight of its own isolation. Jonas, despite everything, remained resolute. The bond between the twins, though twisted and unnatural, was a symbol of strength, of survival. He would not let them die. He could not allow the Duskor bloodline to end. But the more Jonas watched the twins, the more he realized that their survival was not just about strength. It was about something deeper, something he could not explain. Their bond, their connection, was the key to everything, and the source of everything that was slowly destroying the Duskor family. As the days grew colder and the estate continued to deteriorate, Jonas became consumed by thoughts of the twins. Their bond was both a blessing and a curse, and he was powerless to break it. But no matter the cost, he would protect them. He had to. The Duskor bloodline could not end. The estate, once full of life, now felt like a mausoleum. The walls that had once echoed with laughter and work now felt oppressive, heavy with the weight of generations of men who had lived and died for their bloodline. And now, that bloodline was on the brink of collapse. Jonas, though lost in his thoughts, never once let go of his pride. The Duskor men had always been survivors. They had always fought for their legacy, and no matter how twisted the bond between the twins had become, he would never allow their bloodline to end.